And without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's panelists. So first off, we have Dr. Jorge Barraza, who is an assistant professor of consumer psychology at the University of Southern California. And he specializes in applying psychology and neuroscience to understanding and predicting consumer behavior, in particular, the use of stories to influence costly decisions. He is also the co-founder and chief technology officer at Immersion, which provides scalable technologies that leverage neuroscience to quantify our deeply immersive experiences. Our second speaker tonight is Dr. Anastasiya Pocheptsova, assistant professor of marketing at the University of Arizona. She is also a specialist in the areas of human judgment and decision-making, particularly in what types of motivations affect our consumer choices. She is also the head of the Better Decisions Lab, which investigates factors behind financial decision-making, consumerism's role in politics, and the impacts of online reviews. So, warm welcome to both of you. We are very happy to be speaking with you both tonight.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so to get us started, I'd like to get everyone on the same page here. I'm sure a lot of us watching are already aware of the term mob mentality and what it might mean, especially since nowadays with the rise of the internet and internet comment sections, Reddit, and all of these things, they've made it so easy for us to be anonymous and just kind of sink into the crowd. But during these unprecedented times and due to this pandemic, it seems like the effects of mob mentality have kind of skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. So I'd like to start off by first defining kind of a baseline of what we're dealing with here in terms of mob mentality, what's made it so dangerous, and perhaps why it's so easy to become unaware of it. So Dr. Barraza, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, glad to be here. When we think about just herd and mob mentality, I think what we need to remember is that we're fundamentally social creatures, right? So it touches upon how we think, how we feel, and ultimately our behavior. This happens because, you know, we get exposed to certain ways of behaving. We trust the people that we're around, and it prescribes norms or how we ought to behave. Our learning happens socially or through mimicry, right? And there's some fundamental elements of our identity that get tied to the group, right, to the other. So seeing a lot of people, the way they're acting, the way they're thinking, the way they're behaving in a certain way informs us implicitly or sometimes explicitly in a way to validate those thoughts, those behaviors. Otherwise, you wouldn't see that many people engaging in those types of behaviors, right? Especially when we have some sort of tie our own identity to that group, that herd that is engaging in that behavior. So I guess I can just leave it at that at a top level.
Yeah, so one thing that I want to add is sometimes we use this term sort of mob mentality, herd mentality, and it has some negative connotation to it. It doesn't have to, right? There's a lot of positive behaviors that happens through mimicry, right? Mm-hmm. If one of us starts picking up trash outside and others follow, that's a very positive behavior, right? So we eager to mimic both positive and negative behaviors, right? So it can lead to positive behavioral change or negative depending on the situation, right? But it's very fundamental, just as was said before me, fundamental human trait. We're social beings. We learn by mimicking, right? That's what we do. I have, you know, 2 little kids at home. That's exactly what they do. They copy each other and copy us. So it's almost impossible to override that impulse that we have inside of us, right? To mimic behavior of others.
I see. Yeah, I think that was a great introduction to just generally what we're dealing with here. And so now I'd like to move a little bit more into the specifics of our current situation that's been brought about by the COVID-19. And I think the pandemic has proven to put a very great strain on our grocery stores and just our consumer society in general. So I'm asking both of you, how have we seen shifts in what we normally see in the consumer landscape? And I guess to go back to the question in our event title, where did all our toilet paper go? Because I just have to know.
Well, the toilet paper is back, apparently, as is hand sanitizer, right? There's so much hoarding, all of us collectively can do. But I think what basically is happening right now is there's a lot of ambiguity in our world, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know, what the future hold. Is this thing going to end by the time you guys go back to in fall semester, or it's going to stay with us until we have the vaccine for 18 months, right? And as consumers, as human beings, we don't like ambiguity. We have to resolve it somehow. So what we do, we look for some social cues to help us resolve it, right? If I go to a grocery store, say in March, the beginning, and there is a lot of products on the shelves, right? But there is one aisle, for example, toilet paper or hand sanitizer, which is a little bit less, fewer products there, right? I make inferences about behaviors of others. Maybe they know something I don't know in terms of supply chain and why do I need this product to help me resolve this ambiguity I have inside of me, right? And therefore, even though I'm not necessarily physically observe others buying those products in large quantities, but the mere sheer fact that they're not available, right? I have this inference they're scarce that tells me that others behave in a similar way, kind of validates my behavior.
Yeah, I guess to add to that, one of the things that we need to understand right now is that we're going through something pretty important, right? This is something unique in most of our lifetimes. I think for some of us who are a little older, the thing we probably connected to is either 9/11, September 11th, or maybe the 2008 market crash. But that uncertainty that Anastasiya brought up is one of the bigger drivers of this, definitely. The other thing we need to understand is because of the enormity of the moment, our habits are breaking, right? Our habits are dependent on routine. And when you disrupt these routines, now we need to kind of figure out a different way to function. And that's where that uncertainty comes by. It's like, okay, now that I am getting the signal that I need to stay home, right? I need to not go shopping how I usually do, which might've been several times a week. Now I'm trying to do one shopping trip for maybe several weeks. Now it starts looking kind of rational in a way, right? That maybe I usually get a roll of toilet paper, but now I don't know. I'm not going to be at work. I'm going to be working from home. My whole family is going to be at home as well. So there are likely real needs that are also driving this. It's not just the psychological element that's driving this. And there might also be these kinds of beliefs about the market, right? So we can think about scarcity. But scarcity can be divided into two things, right? There's the supply side scarcity, meaning that there's a real scarcity that these things are just not being produced, right? But there's also this demand side scarcity. And that's what we've noticed with toilet paper and with other things like hand sanitizer. Although, fortunate for us, it really has been a demand side. Even when you think about consumer behavior, we're not using more of toilet paper, right? People use the same amount of toilet paper, more or less. So there's going to be a lot of people that have a lot of stockpile of toilet paper. Hopefully it's not any of us, but that consumption element is really happening on that point where we're making decision on what to buy and how much we need to buy. And because of that uncertainty, we just don't know how much we need and if it's going to be there the next time we go around shopping.
I see. Thank you for that insight. So I'm thinking now about what behavioral neuroscience can tell us not just about our current situation, but about how we can start to resolve it. Because obviously it's left us in a state of crisis, but that doesn't mean that we can't use it to our advantage. So going back to what you guys mentioned earlier about like the validation of behavior and how we're constantly seeking the validation of other behaviors like ours to kind of bolster, I guess, our confidence, you could say. I guess there's kind of a dilemma here because on the one hand, yes, that's true. But on the other hand, stores, probably they feel the need to stockpile up on things that they think they can sell a lot of as well. And so it kind of becomes like a vicious cycle of people wanting to buy more and then stores wanting to sell more and wanting to keep everything in stock. Just, for example, stores like Costco. So I'm thinking about how, what are the sort of solutions that we can start to take now that we know that we have this kind of behavior in place?
Yeah, so at least when we think about this use case, which is the store and the toilet paper, the hand sanitizer, and that leading to this kind of scarcity due to the demand, there's several things that could be done. And I've seen a lot of these kind of be rolled out in action, right? And these are classic things from behavioral science, which is, for one, make there be more bottlenecks, right? That if you want people to get less of something, make it a little more difficult, like putting it behind the counter or having it be required to be requested, or putting item limits. The problem with the item limit thing, however, is that it might drive future demand, because now you're saying like, oh, this is something that even though I don't need it, there's a limit to this thing every time I go. So that one can be pretty problematic. So we can start thinking about on the flip side, what we can do to change people's psychology, right? We can make information visible, right? We can start establishing norms that not everybody is engaging in that kind of hoarding behavior. And in fact, what we know from some of preliminary research is that it's only kind of a small minority that's really engaging with what I would consider hoarding behavior, right? Grabbing a couple, one more extra package of toilet paper or one more thing of hand sanitizer is not necessarily hoarding, right? But getting 1 year, 5 years worth, that's definitely the hoarding behavior that we're hoping to limit. So yeah, establishing social norms, making the normative behavior a lot more visible to people, that even though they see those empty shelves, that it's not being driven by everybody just going out and grabbing everything that they possibly can. And then other information, right? I don't think anybody really does the math. I don't know how much a roll of toilet paper lasts. A couple days, a couple weeks. And if I come back with a thing from Costco, is it lasting me a couple months? Half a year? I don't know. So that kind of information might be helpful in order to lessen the demand for things. Yeah, I'll stop right there.
And I think part of what makes it a little bit harder to sort of manage, both on the sort of retailer side and the consumer side, right? A lot of what's happening is not conscious, right? And it has consequences not only for everybody around, take the last roll of toilet paper, but if I continue to overstock, right, it has consequences for my financial future, right? We all nowadays kind of struggling to have to control our finances more than probably ever before. And if I'm driven by these factors, right, I have some research, very recent one, that people now interpret the impulse buy differently, right? Impulse buy to be that pack of candy or gum you do pick up in the checkout line, and it's kind of guilty pleasure. Now your impulse buy could be a 12-pack roll of toilet paper because you just happened to see it, not necessarily because you want it, but it's right there, right? It might be the last one. And it's actually have consequences for your finances. What we find is that people do some mental accounting gymnastic to accommodate those into their budgets, because they have to justify it to themselves buying those new impulse things, right, that they never bought before. It's not only not healthy for everybody else involved, right, so sort of one side of this, but it actually has consequences for your own financial behavior. And one of the things that seem to be working is kind of slowing down this process, which is hard because if you're in a store nowadays, you're trying to get out of there as fast as you can with sort of minimum interaction with other people, but slowing people down, making them wait a little bit, that kind of idea, and just sort of stopping this automatic process. Because one of associated with scarcity in general is a heightened sense of arousal, right? It's a very arousing kind of emotion, right? And when we're in that state, we're trying to act. So kind of calming us down, slowing us down actually helps.
I see. Thank you for your input. So along the lines of these questions that we're asking, I'm sure a lot of people are probably wondering, where exactly can we draw the line between staying prepared and being like irrationally in a panic? Because although it seems clear in hindsight, but oftentimes when you're in the moment, maybe like 2 or 3 months ago when this was really kind of a feeding frenzy, it can be hard to tell. And so I guess my question is, how do we know where to draw the line, and how can we make ourselves more aware of where we stand between those two sides?
It's an incredibly thin line, right? Because going back to beginning our conversation, this is unprecedented time. We never lived through anything like this, most of us at least. There's a lot of ambiguity, which also helps us in a sense that it allows us to justify the hoarding and overbuying. The fact that we don't know how long it's going to last. Maybe it is the last toilet paper in the world. I don't know, right? So it's hard. It's pretty easy to justify these choices nowadays.
Yeah, it's always easy for us to justify and rationalize our own behavior. We're really, really good at that, right? We're really good at saying, oh, it's them who are creating the problem, not me. So maybe step one really is being truly mindful of the motivations that we are driving the behaviors that we're engaging in, for one. Especially given that uncertainty, like Anastasiya said, it's a really, really fine line. I mean, even as scientists, it's hard for us to say that something is rational versus irrational. We don't use those labels typically for that reason. Something that might look rational to us might be irrational to somebody else. So yeah, I think understanding whether or not certain signals are likely playing a role, like if it is that empty store shelf, if it is this sense of, well, everybody is doing it, I think I just need to do it just in case. Especially if it's a costly behavior, right? If it's something that's going to be damaging either to our budget, or that we're engaging in behaviors like, that now we're panicking every time we're going to the store, then that's the kind of stuff that we really should be mindful of and be aware of, because even though we should prepare and we should be careful, we're talking about a low probability thing, right? For us to get sick is still sort of low probability. For us to get very sick is still kind of a low probability. I'm saying this still with caution, right? That I'm not stating that we shouldn't be careful. We definitely should. But we should not be living our lives in a heightened sense of fear constantly, because that's really not what the moment calls for.
I see. So yeah, going off of that, I think we've done a lot so far to kind of talk about the ways that we can start to resolve the social unrest and a lot of the individual anxiety that I'm sure this pandemic has caused. So to that end, I would like to ask both of you if you have any sort of resources or references that you would recommend for people who are looking to get help, or to maybe to read more about things that pertain to mental health, or things that can kind of help them to relieve these anxiety.
Let me unmute myself. Yeah, I have a couple things that I can direct. I know a good portion of our attendees today are college university students, and I know that many colleges and universities are being very proactive and providing online virtual resources. So just because you can't go somewhere in person, there's definitely a lot of easing that's going on to be able to essentially access professional assistance, whether it's through a therapist or through other types of resources. I really like, from an academic standpoint, there's a couple of labs and centers that focus on well-being and resilience. One that stands out for me is the Greater Good Science Center out of Berkeley, and I'll post the link to that. The American Psychological Association recently made available a lot of articles that are related to COVID-19, not just on the kind of mental health and well-being end, but also on the side of just general behaviors that have been studied or that are relevant to COVID-19. And I guess lastly, I would say, because this is a lot of not a lot, but there's a lot of undergraduates here. For those of you who are applying to graduate programs or thinking about it, I think the good news there is that we're going about as business as usual. I'm part of the master's in applied psychology program at USC. And I know for my program, we're actually expecting a lot more people that are US-based students because we're likely not going to get a lot of foreign international students coming to us. In psychology, I think the good news is that we're industry agnostic, right? We're not tied to the airline industry or automotive or entertainment, these industries that are taking big hits. So I think there's good news for the psychologists, and I'm sure marketers as well. I have a heavy presence in market research. So I see a lot of what's going on there. There's a flurry of research going on. Insights Association has a great website that provides a lot of information and resources on COVID-related activities too. So I'll post those in the chat box.
Those are fantastic, thank you. So I actually want to suggest something a little bit more local in a sense. So what we talked at the beginning of this session was this idea of how mob mentality and social influence affects us, which is kind of interesting because now all of us are social distancing. So probably actually not physically seeing that many people, right, besides a family, maybe our roommates, but we make a lot of social inferences from what we believe other people are doing and what we observe in online, right? And it's pretty easy to make mistakes this way, right? Because that's kind of 2 or 3 steps removed from reality. So my recommendation, I do it in my classes as well, right? Because now we're teaching online, it's a very different world, is, pick up a phone and actually talk to a real person and ask what they're doing, right? Instead of making those inferences. And you would be, surprised to have a Zoom session with your group mates, right? Your former classmates. You'd be surprised how similar your things that are happening to each one of you are. And maybe that would ease a sense of panic and ambiguity and sort of uncertainty, right? And try to still kind of rely more on actual people than trying to figure out social influences from online behavior, what you read there.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of what we've been seeing. A lot of market research reports have been showing that people are taking up a lot of nostalgic activities. And it makes sense because it makes people feel good. It makes people feel connected, right? We're talking about, sewing, crocheting, bread making, planting a garden, or taking up a craft. The great part about that is that many of these activities can be social activities, right? You can learn from, say, your parents or your grandparents and connect to them in ways that might not have been straightforward or even instinctual in the past. So, take advantage of this opportunity to make those connections.
Yeah, I think that's actually very interesting because we've kind of gone full circle now from talking about how these mob mentality aspects can be a huge burden on society, but if we play them out correctly, they can actually work to kind of bring society back together and restore us to our former state, which I think is really great. So yeah, this is, I think it's 8:30 now, so this marks around the end of our introductory remarks. So now I'm gonna start fielding some of the questions I've been getting from our audience members. And just to remind you all, the chat room is open, so just feel free to send all of your questions to me, Jason, and I will start asking all of your questions now. All right, so let's see. Okay, and by the way, these are all, I will anonymize all of them, so no need to feel like you're gonna get called out or anything. All right, so our first question is, okay, I see there's a bit of, because Columbia has like a class called Contemporary Civilization that's kind of like a philosophy-based class. So it's kind of drawing inspiration from that. So this person says, we studied Rousseau in Contemporary Civilization and talked a lot about how a lot of these selfish actions are kind of inherent to man, and Rousseau talks about them as kind of like the downfall of society and how we're all kind of doomed to a certain extent once we start interacting with each other. But I'm just wondering if modern neuroscience has anything to say about explaining this phenomenon as to like why this hoarding phenomenon exists just from a neuroscience perspective.
I'm thinking that's directed to me. Yes? No?
To both of you, honestly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to take it or should I? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'll say a lot of my earlier work was on the hormone oxytocin, along with research around mimicry and how that manifests neurophysiologically. And so what we see, like Anastasiya mentioned earlier, is that mimicry is fundamental to us. We started engaging in it, you know, at infancy, and there is no monopoly on mimicry and on social influence from the negative side, from the dark side. I think it's kind of helpful right now. I'm doing a marathon on Star Wars, so the dark side versus the force, right? It's not necessarily that clear cut, right? If we assume that biology wires us for social influence, to be influenced by others, to mimic others, it does not say for good or ill. It just says that it does. Fortunately or unfortunately, that mimicry, that sense of belonging feels good to us, and we want to engage in those behaviors. Sometimes it's through just being complicit, right? That we understand that we're doing it for that reason, to feel that sense of belonging. And sometimes it's implicit, that we just behave with it without even thinking about that we're being influenced. So I think when it comes to the neuroscience of things, it says that we are both moral and immoral due to our nature. It's not taking sides.
I see. Anastasia, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I don't do neuroscience research, but even from sort of judgment decision-making economics, we're not as selfish as we think we are, right? Many of you probably have taken game theory, right? When people have to share resources, and the rational would be always to hoard all resources to yourself, but we barely ever observe that behavior in real world or in the lab, right? So I think we're not as doomed as we might think we are.
I see. Just out of my own curiosity, actually, Dr. Barraza, do you know if like hormonal responses are some of the things that are currently being used to deal with anxiety patients who might be seeking therapy in terms of like drug treatment therapy or things like that?
I mean, there's been talk of that, and there's been a lot of clinical trials around that, particularly with oxytocin. We already know the use of drugs to manipulate serotonin around this space. So the answer to that is yeah, sort of, but potentially not the way that we think about it. I think there's ways to essentially hijack that system, and my old mentor used to say, "Hugs, not drugs," right? That we can do this by understanding if our neurobiology is responding to our social environment, and we can engage in activities that do it in a positive sense, like through positive social interactions, like through engaging pro-socially, right? Because what we understand from emotions like fear, right? Fear is an emotion that leads us to be a little more inward facing, right? That makes us engage in more self-regarding behaviors. Some people might say selfish or whatnot, but if we understand that, engaging in other regarding behaviors might actually counteract that to some degree.
I see. Thanks for the insight. Let's see. All right, so I have another question. So this person is asking about, okay, so they're asking about the kind of the individual standpoint on all this. So a lot of what we talk about in terms of scientific phenomenon, or even just in the news and mass media, it talks about populational phenomena and the tendencies of groups to interact with each other. But this person is wondering, just in terms of like an individual level, what would be the best way to convince people that you know who are engaging in behavior that is not being altruistic and not being more beneficial for the greater good, in essence?
So convincing probably not going to work, right? We had a conversation earlier about justifying what we do. That's pretty easy. What we know work from behavior perspective now is sort of small nudges, right? You can gently, in most cases subtly, direct behavior in a appropriate direction, right? Reminding people, depending obviously what kind of behavior it is, that other alternatives exist, maybe highlighting sort of using social influence to your positive side if you can. Things of that nature that appear small actually usually have bigger impact than sitting down and having a conversation about selfish behavior.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. It's hard to do direct persuasion. It really is. There's a lot of things that are bottlenecks to that, right? There's counter arguing, there's reactance, right? People don't want to be that, and if we're justifying our behavior, we might not see it the way that you see it, right? We're justifying our behavior, and we're saying, no, you're not seeing it. That my behavior is actually truly rational, right? The other thing is that we see, at least from some early research, that when it comes to hoarding in particular, is that people that already are lower on positive social orientation, less likely to have this kind of more of a pro-social orientation and have lower levels of social trust, are the ones that are engaging in this hoarding behavior a little bit more. So I think it's spot on that we need to think about how to do this in a way that is not as intrusive and that is communicating things at a more implicit level, because this is happening mostly in that implicit level, that people don't necessarily have awareness of the true motivations, underlying motivations to their behavior.
I see. Thank you for the input. So we've got another question now that pertains to the potential timeline that we could be facing with this pandemic. So let's see. Do we think that the panic or bulk buying craze that we saw at the beginning of COVID-19 spread throughout the US will resurface if we get hit with a second wave this fall or this winter? Or do you think that we've learned our lesson?
Well, I think, first of all, we already observed some adaptation, right? How people behave at the beginning and how we behave now is quite different, right? We are, even though there's still a great amount of uncertainty, people adapt, right? But what we don't know yet is, our changes in our behaviors, right? The habits we develop now, are they long lasting, right? Or the moment the restrictions are lifted, which are now in some of the states are, right? We go back to our sort of pre-COVID kind of behavior. Or the third alternative would be is, now that we crave so much more social interaction, we crave more experiences, right? They've been completely taken away from us. Sort of like any kind of motivational state that it couldn't fulfill before, now we're going to value them even more, right? So there's a lot of different possibilities, and it's, as I said, it's also going to interact with the timeline and whether the cases come back. There's a lot of still we don't know, right, to make those predictions.
Yep, we don't know. That is the correct answer there. I've seen some research to show that people are, what they're missing most now, what they want to start engaging in, is in those kinds of activities, like going to events, going to concerts, engaging in things that have a lot of people. But at the same time, those are the same behaviors that, if restrictions are lifted, you're not going to see business as usual still, right? It's going to be dependent more on individual differences. We're seeing that already, that some individual differences, whether it be political ideology, which has been the one that's been more studied here, may be driving whether I or someone else is going to be returning to business as usual faster or not. And most of that will be driven by that uncertainty, driven by how we perceive a new normal, driven to, when we talk about market research, sometimes we talk about market segments, right? It's like, what market segment do you fit in? How are you going to behave? And it really depends on the interaction of who I am and how I'm responding and where I'm living and how other people are responding.
And if I may add, it also gives, from marketing or from branded perspective, opportunity for innovation, right? So we're thinking, well, there's two worlds, the world before and the world now. They're distinctly different, but there is a happy medium, right? For example, Peloton, I don't know if you guys are familiar, which is used to be sort of a very niche brand that has this bike, high-end kind of bike with online classes. And everybody's like, well, it's maybe people will do it. There's a small segment, maybe stay-at-home moms, I don't know. Now it's huge, because what it did, it allowed this weird blend in of reality where now, which is social distancing, I cannot go to the gym, with some illusion of social interaction, because there's literally hundreds of thousands of people taking the class with me with a live instructor, right? Which sort of transforms a product into an experience. So I think in terms of on the business side, and obviously on consumer and receiving end, we're going to see a lot more innovation like that, where people kind of, I still want to have an experience. I understand I probably won't be able to go to a movie theater with 1,000 people or concert. How can I find something that's as a happy medium in between?
I see. Yeah, now I'm seeing a follow-up question, but Anastasiya, I think you might have answered that in part. They were just asking about, just on the flip side, not from the consumer perspective, but now from the business perspective, what changes are we anticipating in terms of how businesses are starting to change their selling tactics, or even like trends that we're starting to see now, not even in the future?
Oh yeah, we're seeing a lot now. We're seeing it not just in advertising, and we've all probably seen, if you haven't, you can look at it through YouTube, like the stereotypical COVID ad, right? And they all look the same, they all sound the same, they're all saying the same thing. But outside of that, businesses really need to consider, what are the real pain points, what are the real emotional states, need states that people are experiencing now, and it might continue over time, right? So when you think about QSR, quick service restaurants, or anything in the food industry, right? The notion of being safe, of being sanitized is going to be a big driver. I know Panera, for instance, has one of the things that they simply implemented, which is not a big deal, is that kind of quick pickup window. They would put your bag down and you grab it. Well, now they fold the top and they put a sticker. I mean, is it sealed? Not really, but it is a signal, right? That they care. But to me, it's like there's some kind of added layer of security, even though it's minimal. And I think you'll see a lot of businesses start going through that process. I find it interesting, and I don't know what's going to happen here, but there's going to be a push-pull between small business and large business, right? We can think about, when it comes to small business, we definitely want to think in the small scale. We might want to think local, but at the same time, if we were to have to take a trip to another city, would we feel more comfortable going to an Airbnb, right? Or would we be more comfortable going with a Marriott, where we understand that there is this whole procedure that was worked from top down, where with Airbnb, maybe they're just, it's someone's son or something that's cleaning up from the last tenant. So
I see. Okay, I have another question. And this one pertains a little bit more to the relation of this mob mentality in terms of how it's been affecting different social classes. So the question is, are these herd mentality tendencies evenly distributed across income levels and social classes? For example, are people of higher income levels more likely to engage in these behaviors than lower income, or vice versa?
Well, I think when we talked at the beginning, right, the sort of social mimicry is fundamental. It really doesn't change by your gender or your class, right? What we do observe, though, is the sort of inequality between consumers grows, right? For somebody in a high income bracket, they can stockpile for months of supplies, right? And that both limits their sort of exposure to the virus, but also allows them a lot more choices to make, right? In terms of where we buy, how we buy things, et cetera, right? And not everybody can afford that. And something that we talked at the beginning again was this idea of if I'm engaged in this herd mentality behavior and I'm overbuying, right? Again, when I have a lot of resources, probably doesn't have a particular negative effect on me. It might have a negative effect on you if you go to the store after me. But if I don't, right, those decisions matter for my household sort of ability to function for the next couple of months, right? So I don't think behavior is necessarily different. The consequences of the behavior are obviously going to be very, very different.
Yeah, and I think we see it typically playing out in different product categories, that even though we see this herd mentality across the board, when we start looking at prior catastrophic events like 9/11 or other pandemics in other countries, you do see a spike in vice behavior upticking. Like right now we're seeing an uptick in alcohol consumption. But you also see an uptick in things like luxury good buying most often. And so clearly there's going to be an element of socioeconomic class that's going to be playing out in that as we move forward.
I see. Thank you for the insights. So that actually, so far I haven't received any more questions. If you do still have questions, feel free to keep on sending them in. But I thought just to round off the hour, it would be good to end this discussion with a few closing statements. So to both of you esteemed panelists tonight, if you have any final takeaways that you want people to walk away from this discussion with, things that you like really want to leave a good impression with our audience today with, now would be the perfect opportunity.
Well, that was a tall order they created right there. I think a couple of takeaways. One is, yes, what we're observing is sort of unprecedented, but we do have sort of mechanism and literature and prior experiences to explain what's going on, right? In terms of how we behave as humans individually and how we behave as consumers collectively, right? So that should give us a little bit of comfort, understanding that we all behave kind of similar way. If we pause and kind of realize what's happening, we might sort of slow down consumption, for example, consume less vices possibly, or other things of that nature. So that's helpful. The other thing we mentioned a little bit is that companies and businesses, even educational institutions, right, innovate reasonably fast, right? We all converted to online teaching or learning. It may have been a little bit bumpy, but we kind of figured it out, right? Companies offer contactless deliveries now, a lot more options for you available this way than it was even in March, right? So we collectively as a society will figure out how to manage this situation, right? Even as restrictions going to lift up a little bit. And the third one for you sort of as undergrad students is, I think it is something to, it is a fundamental experience you're going through. And it's okay to say to yourself, you know, this is something that neither my parents and hopefully none of my children would ever live through. And yes, I may behave irrationally from, you know, day to day here and there, and that's okay, right? It's something that no one of us have been prepared for. Something you're probably going to tell your grandchildren about, right? That experience, because hopefully it's not going to replicate. So it's okay to give yourself a little bit of breathing room and maybe lower some of your goals, and that's okay. And just do the things you are able to do every day, and that's fine.
Yeah, I'll start off by echoing that sentiment, is that it's okay. You know, if you're not taking full advantage of this time, you know, if you're seeing in social media that people are learning different kinds of languages, starting a massive garden and taking on, and you're not doing those things, that's fine. You are going through something that is once in a lifetime, hopefully. but that said, really, like I started off at the beginning of our session, is habits are breaking because those cues, those environmental cues, have been disrupted. So we do have the opportunity to restructure our lives at this time. If we have the opportunity, let's try to see if we can take advantage of it. If we're not proactive, at least let's be self-reflective to see what habits we may be forming at the present moment. And at a macro scale, we can definitely see this as an opportunity, right? So at a macro scale, it's not necessarily habits, maybe it's these norms. We can quickly see this when it comes to work, right? That all of a sudden, everybody's working remotely. So companies are learning that, hey, the sky doesn't fall when we have everybody working remotely, or the people that can work remotely are working remotely. So I think there's definitely going to be a lot of changes, both driven from the company side, and employees in and of themselves are going to demand it as well. So I think there's lots of good that can come from this in terms of how we shift how both our economy and just our society is structured. Not in the political sense, but just in our day-to-day activity and how we function.
All right. Thank you both for your brief summarizations. If I may myself take a stab at it, I think we've learned a lot tonight about just how generalized actually a lot of our behavioral patterns are, and just how much they kind of permeate our society. And to put it from my own perspective, I would say that just because something has bad effects on the outset doesn't necessarily mean that we have to make it stay that way. So I think, as we've all learned tonight, if we as a society keep our ears open, keep our hearts open, and really start to make the effort to pull ourselves back together, it will actually be a lot easier than we think it is, because of the behavioral norms that dictate pretty much all of humanity. So yeah, I think that is a great way to wrap up tonight. First off, I would like to thank both Dr. Barraza and Anastasiya for joining us on this incredible journey to try and make sense of all of the chaos that we've been going through. So thank you both.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
Everybody.
Yeah, and next I would like to thank all of my fellow executive board members on CSR, Alana, Adriana, and Jackie. Just like to give a shout out to them for helping to put this entire event together and making all this possible. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for being out here with us today and participating in this much needed discussion. So yeah, I guess that concludes our event for tonight, and stay curious. Thanks, guys.
Good, everyone.
Thank you.